All right, U.S. history students, hello. We got a lesson here where I admit I kind of take two stray ideas that fit into this general period of time, and they're both interesting. They're both kind of compelling stories in their own way, and we just kind of put them together here. They're two concepts we need to know about, and they're worth our time. They don't, but I just kind of grab them together and say this will make for a good whole story. These two half stories, we'll put them together. So I want to talk about what socialism is a little bit and how it kind of intersected with the American story, how it gets introduced into American political life, and then a really memorable and strange election with maybe some lessons for us in there. So we can see our targets. I can weigh the merits of socialism and explain its appeal. Whether we agree with it or not, I think it's good to say I can understand what its merits might be and consider why people might like it. And I can just draw lessons from this election of 1912. Now, before we get into socialism is a type of an economy. And I remember teaching this lesson, I don't know, years ago, and I had a student, a very sweet student who showed her own kind of courage here. And she just raised her hand and just said, "Can you explain what an economy is? You keep using this word this year, Mr. Welly, and I feel like I don't know what it is." And I thought, that's great. And I tried to explain it to her, just off the top of my head. And then I realized this is a hard one to explain, isn't it? So anyway, I just thought for clarity's sake, stepping back, what's an economy? An economy, it's the way that we determine how our wealth and resources are distributed in any given society. So imagine we got the society here of our classroom, and imagine all the wealth and resources that we have and all the wealth and resources that we may have in the future that we may develop. Who decides who ends up with what? What are the rules by which we determine why some people have this and other people have that? And do we all have the same? And is that decision all made by one central person like me, the teacher, or the government? Or they're just sort of like a set of rules of the game and we all follow them, and then wealth and resources end up with different people depending on how the rules of that system play out? That's an economy. We live in a free market capitalist economy, more or less. And so the rules of that system really emphasize competition, profit-seeking, consumer choice, and it's all these kinds of things we talked about with our free market lesson, back in the last unit. So that's the system we tend to live in. Socialism says, I don't think that's the best way to distribute and to determine who gets what wealth and who gets what resources, right? Socialism is a counterpoint to capitalism. It just says this, the free market principles end up producing way too much inequality. That's the problem with capitalism, according to socialists. It just produces way too much where some people have this and other people have that, and it's just not okay. And so what if we set up a system of rules or a system in which we emphasize the sharing of resources rather than competing for things? And what if we tried various methods like, higher rates of taxation and more social programs to promote more equality? That's like the basic, in a nutshell version of socialism. Socialism, it's an old idea. It's as old as hunter-gatherer groups sharing the things that they hunted and gathered. It's not like it's necessarily a modern concept. I'd say the modern incarnation of socialism is most famously first articulated by Karl Marx, German philosopher who was working in Britain, actually, during the Industrial Revolution. And he creates a whole theoretical construct of Marxism and the sort of socialism that gets picked up and carries to lots of places. And I think the appeal of it on some level is just the idea of what if we could have a more equitable or equal sharing of resources and wealth? What if we could emphasize sharing instead of profit seeking and competition? And what if people weren't necessarily selfish and self-interested, right? This last notion, socialism isn't necessarily connected. It says people don't have to be the way that they seem to be right now. Human nature doesn't have to be so broken and fragmented and competitive and self-centered. If we changed our systems, if we changed the rules of the game around us, if we changed the rules of our economy, we might incentivize a whole different set of behaviors that are much more interested in collectivism and sharing. I would ask you, what do you think of that idea? What's your notion that human nature doesn't necessarily have to be so broken? And we could perhaps reprogram, to some extent, human nature to be better, more cooperative, to share more. You buying that? I think it's fair to say that uh, there's not like necessarily a clear line between where socialism ends and, where capitalism ends and socialism begins. It's much more of a kind of a gradient or a spectrum. So, as we can see here, we've got free market capitalism might exist all the way on this end of the spectrum. And that would be something like what we traditionally have in the United States. And then as we move along, somewhere in the middle, you have a mixed economy. Like when you go up to Canada, our friends to the north, and we go to Canada, there's going to be plenty of competition between, customer service places and gas stations and restaurants and retail stores and competition driving prices, of course. But then when it gets to certain things like, healthcare, for example, that will be socialized, right, or nationalized, meaning there are no private companies competing with each other for your dollars and to get you to spend, your healthcare dollars with them. Instead, it's going to be one nationally run program that everybody takes part in and is paid for through taxes. It's not paid for with direct fees from consumers. And so having some components of capitalism and some components of socialism would be like a mixed economy. And socialism would be, government would run most or all of the major industries, most or all of the major types of companies. That would be a socialist system like what we'd see in China or Venezuela. You can go to all the way, Marx has this thing of like beyond socialism comes pure communism, a utopia in which everything is shared. There is no private property at all, right? Everything is shared with everyone. Communism, it sounds pretty pie in the sky, and it is pretty pie in the sky, but that's sort of way out there. And the places that sort of claim we have reached pure communism, these tend to be dystopian nightmares that you want nothing to do with. And so, there's like a spectrum that moves along. And so the conversation in America in the 20th century and 21st century to some extent has been like, should we bump things along a little bit more, a nudge one way or the other? But it's not necessarily a category of this is capitalism, and once you do this step, then now you're into socialism. That's just not really how this sort of thing tends to work. Here's a quick scenario for you. Imagine here at your seat that the school institutes a policy where we just say, we're uncomfortable with the fact that a lot of students get A's and we've got honor roll students, but then at the same time we have some students that get C's and D's, or some students that at a certain point they can't quite hang in a Southwest Christian high school classroom. So what if, for the purposes of equality, because we believe that all people are image bearers of God, for example, I don't know, I'm just coming up with an argument, we decide, the highest grade you can get at Southwest is a B+. We don't want anyone getting to that A range because it makes too many people who struggle kind of feel not awesome about themselves. But the lowest grade you can get is a C+. And so there will still be some differences between the highest and the lowest. But frankly, we've shrunk. It used to be like this, but now we've kind of shrunk it where it looks like this. So the best you can get is a B+. The lowest you can get is a C+. We're going to move ahead that way. Imagine the outcome. What do you suppose would be common student responses? People who like the policy, why would they like the policy? What would be their reasons? People who are frustrated by the policy, why would they be frustrated by that policy? What would be their reasons? And then here's the question for you. What would happen to general levels of academic productivity across the school? When you consider what you see during open hours out in the commons, do you feel like you would probably begin to see more academic productivity and people getting after it and working? Or do you feel like you would see less academic productivity and people getting after it and working as a result of this? What do you suppose you would see? I think it's fair to say when we're getting ready to finish up this first half here, in general, socialist economic systems, whether we're talking about Sweden or China or, the United Kingdom, Britain is kind of a mixed economy. I think in general, they do what they say they're going to do, which is reduce the levels of economic inequality. They do distribute wealth a little more equally. I think it's silly to say that they don't do that. It's also really fair to say that what they don't do is they don't produce as much economic productivity. They just don't tend to produce as much economic activity. There's this, image that I sort of like, which is like a fire, and this fire is cooking hot, right? This furnace is really cooking right now. The fires of economic productivity are hot. Workers are out there and they are like working hard, and everyone across the economy is churning, and companies are trying to trying to produce and people are spending and then they're working and all that stuff is going on. What is driving that? What's the fuel of that fire? Well, the fuel of that fire is profit motive. Businesses trying to get your dollars, right? Competing for your dollars, or competition. They're competing for your dollars, or I'm competing right now with other teachers who would want my job, as we've talked about before. Laborers have to do this. Capitalism has less security than socialism. If security and to some extent equality are the most important values, then I think socialism should be an economic system that we embrace. But if you'd say security and equality are good values, but there might be more important values, or I kind of like the value of prosperity, right? Or of kind of individual flourishing, or whatever it might be, right? That might point you more toward capitalism, right? This lack of economic security, the fact that I know if I don't do a very good job, I could lose my job, that doesn't necessarily, that can be challenging to hold in my heart, but also it's what keeps me working. It's like it sort of keeps productivity high. And so that's a key idea here in socialism when we compare the two. And to finish this first half, a couple noteworthy voices sort of articulating a similar idea, right? Henry Sedgwick is a British philosopher, and he said, I object to socialism, not because it would divide the produce of industry badly, but because it would have so much less to divide. There would just tend to be less wealth in general, less productivity in general. Or Winston Churchill said, there is one great difference between the socialists of the Christian era, like in the book of Acts, for example. So there's one great difference between the socialists of the Christian era and those of today. The socialism of the Christian era was based on the idea, all mine is yours. But the socialism of today is based on the idea of all yours is mine, meaning the rich people, all yours ought to be mine instead. Okay, there's that first little half idea. Let's pivot now. I introduced socialism because that's going to become part of one of the umbrella groups within this progressive era that we find ourselves in at the start of the 20th century in the United States. And these first decades of the 20th century are really the height of the progressive era. And we have a succession of presidents, starting with Theodore Roosevelt, who all, to one extent or another, really embrace progressivism. They don't necessarily embrace socialism, but all of them would say, let's move the bar a little bit away from capitalism and toward that mixed economy idea. They all to one extent or another would say, let's shift things just a little bit. And when Theodore Roosevelt's presidency concluded in 1912, he'd served his 7 years. Remember, he'd become president when the former president was assassinated. Roosevelt is not even 50 years old. He's like 49, but he decides that he should step down at that point. And he endorses his friend, William Howard Taft, a member of his administration. And Roosevelt says to the American public, hey, if you liked me, if you like these two terms of Teddy Roosevelt, then you're going to love my friend, William Howard Taft, because Taft will carry on all of my policies. And then Roosevelt, Taft wins the election. This is in 1908. Taft wins the election in 1908 to succeed Theodore Roosevelt, and Roosevelt sort of says sayonara and sort of tries to do the thing that former presidents usually do. And what the former presidents usually do is they disappear. They leave the stage and let the next guy or gal deal with the spotlight and all the glory and all the problems that come with it. And TR tries. He tries to leave the spotlight. He tries to leave the stage. He is not well suited for retirement. He is just too, again, that ADHD, hyper brilliant, hyperactive thing that's always going with him is not well suited to not jumping in, especially when he feels like I got a lot of gas left in the tank, right? I'm in my 50s. I'm not in my 70s here. I'm just not ready for a life of retirement. And it also is interesting because he's watching his friend, William Howard Taft, and he's saying, Taft isn't doing things exactly the way that I would do things. And Taft says, you're right. You're right. I'm not doing things the way you would do things because I'm a different person than you. And also Taft said, we are friends. And when I was in your administration, Theodore Roosevelt, I was your friend. But the thing is, the terms of being friends with TR is going to do 99% of the talking. And Taft is an agreeable fellow, very smart, very, I don't know, he's like a really admirable person. But Taft said, my job was to nod my head when you talked and to smile. You didn't necessarily ask me very frequently what I thought. And so for TR to think that Taft totally agreed with him on everything is a little bit of oversight on TR's part. Like TR just never really actually carefully listened to Taft. And so yeah, and I'd say just in general, Taft is less of a bull in a china shop than Theodore Roosevelt is. Taft is maybe, he's a Republican, of course, but he's going to play ball with the old party bosses rather than just sort of go to war with them like TR liked to. And so Taft's 4 years in the presidency are kind of a weird one, and they're frustrating for Roosevelt, and they're also really frustrating for Taft. And so Taft is like, let's say, a Republican with a progressive strain of thinking, but a cautious man. Like in general, a cautious Republican progressive. That's how you could characterize Taft. And Roosevelt's like, come on, go faster. Let's go. Let's see more action. Let's see you take on the big guys, all that sort of stuff. And Taft is like, hey man, you're not president anymore. So thanks for the advice, but I don't know, no thanks, maybe just be quiet. Roosevelt gets in this bad habit of starting to mouth off or spout off to the press, to the media, and the media loves it because they find Taft a little dull and boring after the Roosevelt years. And now they've got a former president from the president's own party and a former kind of close friend who's willing to start chirping about this guy Taft. And this is like just sort of delicious politics and gossip. So this is filling the papers, and Taft is like saying to his former friend, hey, can you like lay off or maybe say a nice word in here somewhere too? Like what gives with this? It's also true that Taft is just not, there's sort of a hangover after Roosevelt and his exciting style of politics. Taft is not really enjoying the presidency. TR is not helping Taft to enjoy the presidency. Taft is not an overwhelmingly popular president. If there's one thing that many students tend to know about William Howard Taft before this class, it's the awful detail that, yes, he got stuck in the bathtub because he was so overweight. William Howard Taft ate his feelings in the White House. A bad move for all of us. Let's be careful with that, boys and girls, eating our feelings. He ate his feelings and got so overweight that, yes, he got stuck in a bathtub. And now the whole country knew about it. And now people 100 years later are going to be talking about it on YouTube. I mean, it's awful. Can you imagine that? And so Taft is like not having a very happy presidency in all kinds of regards. And he's really frustrated that Roosevelt has just sort of, in a weird way, won't get out of the spotlight and won't back down. And that he says, Roosevelt, it's just like you're acting like you're entitled to still be president. You stepped down. Retire. Go away. Let me be president now. And so 4 years after Roosevelt retires in 1908, then 4 years later, it's 1912, and Roosevelt decides, you know what, I'm getting back in it. I want to run for the presidency again. I want that Republican nomination back. I want the Republican Party to take the nomination away from Taft and to renominate me for president in 1912. And for the media, this is great. This is a delicious story, right? It's just like, and TR is back. For the Republican Party, they're like, yeah, I don't know, man. You're kind of like, you're just doing this weird kamikaze attack on our party right now. A lot of the old guard in the Republican Party says, you're right, Taft is not as exciting as you, but Taft works with us. Taft plays ball with us. Taft knows how to kind of mollify the establishment and also play to the public. And TR was just kind of overdoing that. TR was in full kind of bull in a china shop mode, or as he called it, he called his new party, or he says, I'm as strong as a bull moose. He's like, he literally is like, I'm embodying this sort of behemoth animal that wants back in, and I feel strong and ready to roll. And so Taft and Roosevelt are having a battle for again, not for the general election in November, but for who's going to be the Republican nominee for president. And in the end, the Republicans decide to go with Taft. They say to TR, thanks, it was a beautiful 7+ years, it was great, but we need you to find your timeout chair, all right, or just take a deep breath. And Roosevelt doesn't take no for an answer. At that moment, rather than just say, okay, I'll stay within the Republican Party and I'll endorse the Republican nominee of William Howard Taft, my former friend, Roosevelt says, well, I'm breaking off then. Me and my followers will break off from the Republican Party. We'll form a new party called the Progressive Party. And in doing this, of course, what happens is the Democratic Party says, Thank you. That is beautiful. Republicans who've been dominant since the Civil War, the Republican Party just broke in half because Theodore Roosevelt basically broke the Republican Party in half. And so we have a messy election that November with three candidates. Again, the Republican base, there are more Republicans than Democrats in the United States in 1912 by some margin. But there aren't quite enough Republicans to support two candidates who are essentially Republicans, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Taft is, again, probably in many ways the most conservative, though he's still, generally speaking, a progressive who would seek to use the power of government to intervene in economic life more than it had in the past. Theodore Roosevelt is becoming increasingly conservative and has embraced increasingly conservative ideas. Frankly, a lot of them that make Taft say, I don't know, man, you've changed. You're going through some weird journey right now, this progressive journey. And the stuff you're talking about, TR, especially the stuff about maybe the public should be able to vote to overturn court cases. Taft is a lawyer, and later he'll become a Supreme Court judge. And Taft is like, that's crazy. The public is not experts on the law. The public should not be allowed into, the decisions of what is constitutional and what isn't. That's for judges to decide, not the public. And so Taft is like, I'm not sure where you're going on this journey, but I'm not sure I can go with you on it. There's a fellow named Woodrow Wilson who we'll learn about next time. He's a Democrat. He wins, even though, the Democrats didn't get very many votes. Frankly, the Democrats get less votes than they got in the previous election, but the Republicans have broken in half. And so Wilson just benefits from the fact that the Republican Party had split. If we look at this map here, the popular vote between the Progressive Party, which is Theodore Roosevelt, and the Republican Party, which is Taft, we have over half the American public voted for one of the essentially Republican candidates. Only 42% of the country voted for the Democrat. But because of the Electoral College system, right, like the Electoral College throws the election pretty easily to Woodrow Wilson. Because again, in all these states that are traditionally Republican, the two Republican candidates split the vote. So Minnesota and a handful of other states go for Roosevelt. Taft picks up Vermont and Utah. We're happy for you. And meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson cruises to the White House. It's an election that's memorable for the lesson of what happens when you split your party, right? What happens when the party splits between two key nominees and the party can't put itself back together. And parties still hold tightly to this lesson today. All right, students, so that's our two half lessons, right? A look at socialism and a look at the strange election in 1912 and the weird after presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Thank you guys so much. Get the rest of the work done for today, and we'll see you soon. Bye.